UN Reform, a message to all countries of the world. May 8th, 2006. There has been on the global level a lot of talk recently about reform and democracy. They are attractive slogans that can only be rejected by a dictator or a reactionary. A dictator naturally opposes democracy. The reactionary abhors reform. But the whole debate would be rejected by all if it proves to be an exercise of selective propaganda or a misuse of attractive slogans to serve hidden agendas other than those of reform and democracy. If we are truly serious about reform and democracy on the global level, then we must start with the peak of our world. The peak and head of the world is the United Nations. The General Assembly is our world's parliament. If the parliament of the world were not democratized, it would not be possible to accept any call to reform or democratize any national parliament or government in any country in the world. The question is, how do we reform and democratize the UN General Assembly, the World Parliament? The answer is very clear and simple. The World Parliament must be given the same mandate enjoyed by a national parliament in any established democracy. Thus, the General Assembly would be the legislative body, the Security Council would be the executive branch, and the International Court of Justice would discharge the task of the judiciary. The proposal made by the Secretary General of the UN does not merit a second thought. It is utterly irrelevant and so colorless that it does not deserve any consideration. The genuine radical reform dictates the transfer of the powers of the Security Council to the General Assembly. Its resolutions, rather than those of the Security Council, should be the legally binding ones. It is so because the General Assembly is the forum where all the member states meet. Unlike the Security Council, all member states are represented in the General Assembly on an equal footing but without any powers. What is the use, then, of the sovereign equality among member states? Indeed, what is the use of the General Assembly itself if it is nothing but a decorative icon? What is the difference between the UN General Assembly and London's Hyde Park when both are places for speechifying? The Assembly now is just like the Akaz market in pre-Islamic Mecca, which served as a forum to recite poems hailing one party and tarnishing another. The Security Council must be transformed into a tool for the implementation of the resolutions of the Assembly. If this could not be achieved, then the General Assembly must be abolished. The costs and expenditures incurred by the host country and the member states would thus be saved. The Security Council shall remain provided that it is sufficiently expanded. Its new powers, mandate, and composition must be reviewed. The rulings handed down by the International Court of Justice must be fully respected. Those who might oppose this new radical concept of the reform of the international organization will have no leg to stand on when they level their criticism at a country whose parliament has no real legislative power, at a government that does not implement the decisions of the national parliament, or at a state that does not respect the rulings of its courts. How could those who criticize other countries and demand that they follow the path of reform and democratization oppose at the same time the call for the UN General Assembly to have a real legislative power? How could they oppose making the Security Council subordinate to the Assembly and charge it with implementing the Assembly's resolutions? How could they disrespect the international judiciary? Those who oppose this radical reform have no logical right to criticize the undemocratic states. The General Assembly comprises all the member states that have united for peace. Today, however, it is nothing. The General Assembly is gravely insulted in the Charter. It is humiliated and treated like a child. The representatives of the states are slighted in the General Assembly. It is taken lightly in all the articles of the chapter. It cannot do a thing without instructions from the Security Council. Its resolutions are implemented unless endorsed by the Council. It is unable to do certain things save upon a recommendation from the Council. It is well known that the Security Council is the embodiment of dictatorship, while the General Assembly embodies democracy. The Security Council is made up of very few states. It is similar to a dictatorial military junta or an emergency council. It cannot be farther away from any form of democracy and equality. The so-called Security Council is a tool in the hands of a mighty, frightful, and horrendous dictatorship. It is an unstoppable executioner's sword. Its rulings cannot be appealed, however unjust, harmful, or biased they may be. Therefore, the peak of the world, namely the United Nations, embodies the most glaring type of dictatorship. It is inconceivable to talk about reform and democracy at any level without recognizing this flaw in the UN. As long as the world does not exercise democracy in the so-called United Nations, the highest political institution in the world, the call for democracy in any country in the world cannot be taken seriously. And as long as reform efforts focus exclusively on the Security Council, then the world is simply not serious about the reform of the United Nations. The General Assembly is the United Nations. All countries are represented in the Assembly, but the Assembly is nothing. It is another speaker's corner, like that of Hyde Park, a mere decoration, a farce, and a bogus fantasy. Countries incur unnecessary expenses to send their representatives on exhausting trips across continents for the sole purpose of completing the laughable props of the farce. It has no powers and no responsibilities. Sending representatives to the General Assembly where they have no say in and cannot make a binding decision on matters of importance to the peace and security of their peoples is the ultimate insult to nations. All the binding decisions are made by a limited group in the Security Council. The Council is not international in character. Even that limited group is hostage to the veto power of a select few. With one objection, one gesture from a permanent member, all the activities of the United Nations come to a halt. When one country casts a veto, resolutions are preempted and all action is paralyzed. The will and decisions of the members of the powerless General Assembly are humiliated and trampled upon by that one veto. The reform and democratization of the United Nations necessitate the transfer of the powers of the Security Council to the General Assembly, where all countries are represented. The binding resolutions should only be those democratically made by the General Assembly. The Security Council should become only a tool for their implementation. The problems facing the expansion of the Security Council. Number 1. The European Union. This entity is well on its way to becoming a single state with a single market, a single foreign ministry, a single currency, and a single army. Let us imagine that this federal state occupies a number of permanent seats in the Security Council. It already has 2 permanent seats. Germany is a candidate for another permanent seat. If it gets it, the EU will have 3 permanent seats. This will be a grave international problem. If that seat is given to Germany, what would be Italy's position? It would be a terrible injustice to Italy. This is another big problem. If Italy is given a permanent seat, how could one entity occupy 4 permanent seats? This is a major problem. Just imagine what would have happened had the USR had several permanent seats in the Security Council. Imagine also what the situation would be if the USA occupied now a number of permanent seats. Then who will have the right to deny Turkey or Greece that status? This problem will definitely emerge. Number 2. The African Union. That union as well is on its way to becoming one state. Will it be given more than one seat? That will repeat the problem of the EU. If the AU is given only one seat in view of the fact that it will be a single state in the future, who will occupy that seat? If the seat is assigned to the AU, no one state member of it has the right to take the African seat alone. It will be Africa's seat, not a seat for any particular state. This will cause another problem.